Before the Holocaust, before the world associated Germany with industrialized mass murder, there was Namibia. In the early 1900s, in a colony called German Southwest Africa, Germany carried out what many historians now recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. It did not happen in Europe. It happened in Africa. And for decades, most of the world barely spoke about it. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the late 1800s, the era known as the Scramble for Africa. European powers were dividing the continent among themselves, carving borders with little regard for the people who lived there. Germany, newly unified and eager to prove itself as a world power, claimed a vast territory in Southwest Africa. They called it German Southwest Africa. Today, we know it as Namibia. At first, colonial rule was presented as protection and trade. But very quickly, it became something else. German settlers began seizing land from local communities, especially the Herero people, who were largely pastoralists dependent on cattle and grazing land. Water sources and fertile territory were taken. Colonial laws restricted movement. Debt systems and forced labor arrangements tightened control. Tensions grew year after year. By January 1904, the pressure exploded. The Herero, led by Chief Samuel Herero, launched an uprising against German rule. They attacked farms and colonial outposts, targeting symbols of occupation. For a brief moment, the rebellion shocked the German Empire. It exposed how fragile colonial control actually was. Berlin responded decisively. They sent reinforcements under a new commander, General Lothar von Trotha. Von Trotha was not interested in compromise. He believed colonial resistance had to be crushed permanently, not just defeated, but eliminated as a threat. In August 1904, German forces confronted Herero fighters near the Waterberg Plateau. The battle itself was brutal, but what happened afterward is what turned a colonial war into genocide. Rather than allowing surrender or negotiation, German troops pushed tens of thousands of Herero civilians eastward into the Omaheke region, part of the Kalahari Desert. The desert was not an accident. It was strategy. German patrols blocked escape routes. Wells and water sources were guarded or destroyed. Armed units prevented people from returning. Men, women, children, entire families were trapped in one of the harshest environments in southern Africa with little food and almost no water. Thousands died of thirst. Thousands more died from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. Then came the document that removed all doubt about intent. General von Trotha issued what became known as the Extermination Order. It declared that the Herero were no longer German subjects and that any Herero found within German borders would be shot. This was not battlefield chaos. This was written policy. International criticism eventually forced Berlin to withdraw the explicit order, but by then the damage was irreversible. The population collapse was already underway. Survivors who attempted to surrender were not released. They were imprisoned. Germany established a network of concentration camps across the colony. Yes, concentration camps, years before the word would become synonymous with Nazi Germany. One of the most infamous camps was Shark Island, near the coastal town of Luderitz. Conditions there were catastrophic. Prisoners were forced into hard labor, building railways and infrastructure for the colonial regime. They were underfed. Disease spread rapidly. The Atlantic winds cut through the thin clothing of detainees. Exposure, malnutrition, and overwork became routine. Historical estimates suggest that between 1,000 and 3,000 people died on Shark Island alone. Across the colony, the numbers were far worse. The Nama people, another indigenous group in the region, also rose up against German rule in late 1904. They too faced devastating retaliation, imprisonment, and mass death. By 1908, when the violence subsided and the camps began closing, the demographic impact was staggering. Most mainstream historical estimates state that roughly 40 to 80,000 Herero were killed, often described as around 80% of their population. Around 10,000 Nama died, roughly half of their people. Exact numbers vary because colonial record-keeping was incomplete and entire communities disappeared from documentation. But what is not debated is scale. Entire societies were shattered. Land was permanently transferred to German settlers. Survivors were subjected to forced labor systems that reshaped the colony's economy. And the psychological trauma echoed through generations. Some historians argue that the ideology and administrative practices tested in Namibia foreshadowed later horrors in Europe. Concepts such as racial hierarchy, extermination language, and concentration camp systems did not appear out of nowhere decades later. They had precedents. Yet after World War I, Germany lost control of the colony. The global focus shifted, and this chapter faded from mainstream European memory. For much of the 20th century, it remained marginal in textbooks. It was not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that international scholarship and activism pushed the events into broader public awareness. In 2021, Germany officially recognized the killings of the Herero and Nama as genocide. The German government announced a financial package of 1.1 billion euros to fund development and reconstruction projects in Namibia over a period of years. The agreement was framed as reconciliation, not formal legal reparations, a distinction that remains controversial. Many descendants of the victims argue that recognition without direct reparations or land restitution is incomplete justice. In 2025, Namibia observed its first official Genocide Remembrance Day, marking more than a century since the events began. The debate continues about responsibility, memory, compensation, and historical truth. But one thing is clear. Between 1904 and 1908, in the deserts and camps of what is now Namibia, the German Empire carried out a campaign that destroyed the majority of the Herero people and devastated the Nama. It was systematic. It was documented. And for decades, it was barely discussed. History does not begin in 1939. Sometimes, the warning signs appear much earlier. And sometimes, the world looks away.